getting ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Hello and welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor, and with me as ever is the inclement Ian Hardingham.
Hello Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. I've installed some mutators on myself this week, including low gravity and instagib.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Sony held a press conference yesterday as part of Paris Games Week. Particular attention was given to Sony's upcoming PlayStation VR hardware, with demos from some of the 200 third-party developers apparently currently working on PS VR titles. There's quite a lot of games in this, which we will discuss in a minute. Also, some news came out that the Wii U is picking up some sales pace, with stuff like Mario Maker and Splatoon driving hardware sales and also selling very well in their own right. So I'd like to ask you, Ian Hardingham, what is the current state of the console landscape?
Yes, it's good to sometimes check in with big platform holder events like this, because I don't watch very, very closely to what's being released very much anymore, and I don't get massively excited about first-party titles anymore. I remember being younger and getting really excited about that kind of thing, but it's not really on my radar, so it's really nice to actually be forced to look at what a big company do when they've got so much space, as Sony do have at their own event.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're focusing so much on PlayStation VR. I'm still pretty unimpressed by sort of VR in general, and it's certainly not the part of the presentation that I'm interested in. I wanted to focus on one of the games they announced, a game called Until Dawn: Rush of Blood.
Yes.
Which is apparently a VR roller coaster game with a twist, which just sounds like about the worst thing you could possibly make on any level. Media Molecule have a new game. These are the guys that did Little Big Planet and Tearaway, and that looks quite interesting. It's called Dreams. Yeah, they always seem to get it right. Media Molecule's one of the most consistent developers, it seems. They really understand what they're doing in this uncertain world. So generally, seeing a lot of stuff about Uncharted 4 coming out next year, a bit of stuff about No Man's Sky. It seemed relatively healthy, but for me, again, it kind of just underlined how little I'm interested in first-party stuff.
Yeah, I think it was a good press conference for them. I think they showed a really nice range of stuff. They led off with all of the Big Bang Bangs and the COD Blops and the Street Fighters and the Tekkens. I'm still surprised that anyone is still interested in Tekken at all, but given that they're making a new Tekken game, that probably is the case. Tekken is not big in the fighting game community as an esport, so it kind of exists in this weird space of nostalgia. But then new fighting games coming out now get a lot of attention. Mortal Kombat 10 got a lot of attention, so maybe Tekken is a good play. And then you've got the mix of the arty Sony stuff. You've got Quantic Dream with the Ex Machina-alike Detroit, which looks very Quantic Dream-like. And yeah, Dreams. Now, Dreams is an interesting one because it seems to me just really to be like a third-person Little Big Planet. It is really kind of what they're going for here. And I feel like that'll work, perhaps for me, a bit better than Little Big Planet did, because it won't rely on the 2D platform mechanics, which I felt they never really got right. So I'm actually kind of interested in Dreams. The demo they showed was kind of fun and quite intriguing. And as you say, they do always get it right. So Sony's lineup here, I think, is pretty strong.
Yeah, I always worry about trying to put a construction game like that in 3 dimensions. I think it's a lot harder than kind of the simplicity of doing it in 2D. And also, while I agree that Little Big Planet didn't really nail the platform mechanics, which you kind of have to, platforming itself is a much I think, much more popularist and wider appeal than what Dreams is going for. So I can see sort of pluses and minuses there. These games, they're not really for me. Like, I'd be much more interested in playing Mario Maker than Little Big Planet, really. But I think that's pretty good. Yeah, Sony are in a good place. We're talking about the Wii U. Let's shift on to that. People seem to think this is not doing particularly well. It's sold apparently about 11 million consoles in total, and 12.5 million Wii U consoles, and they've sold 70 million individual games, which is interesting. The Vita's sold about 12 million units, as we were talking about last week.
Indeed.
So that's not a great place to be. And Mario Maker's only sold about 1.9 million copies or something, 1.4 million, which doesn't seem very high. So I don't think there's anything here which disputes the idea that the Wii U is still kind of basically a failure. What do you think about that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just interesting to see that there's stuff like Amiibo coming in, which is doing very well and is very profitable. And that was kind of quite a big play by them. I think people forget these things. So they actually have quite a lot of irons in the fire, Nintendo. And it's sort of interesting, maybe as they're gearing up towards NX, which will be their shot at sort of trying to get this idea right, potentially. Maybe they're trying to find the kind of games that people want. No, Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer at 2.2 million, 2.02 million, sorry, that's a very good result for something that's basically a spin-off kind of creative game there. So these creative things are now sort of flipping over into the console market. I can't remember the name of it. Sony announced a music game, a music racing game in the style of Frequency and all of those old games where you can kind of build a track both musically and in a racing sense. So that I think people are really getting on board with this creativity thing. VR and stuff, it's interesting that Nintendo in fact don't have any VR stuff on the horizon. I don't know if they'll feel like they have to catch up at some point and do some
Once
kind of
bitten, twice
thing.
shy on the VR aspect. I personally, I much prefer trying these creative things when it's indies doing it. I really like the kind of the weird jankiness and the sort of craziness that comes along with an indie trying to bite off far too much with creative stuff. And I've always been alienated by big AAA companies doing stuff like that. It's never quite worked for me. But anything on the 3DS that's popular or made by Nintendo tends to sell really well. It's such a stark contrast to the Wii U. It's just really weird. I wonder whether the Wii U would still be around at all if they didn't have the 3DS propping them up. And as far as Amiibo goes, it's such an obvious play. Once they saw that Skylanders did so well, Disney's Infinity, Amiibo makes so much sense. And in all honesty, I'd probably rather collect characters based on old Nintendo games I liked than play some of their new stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that's doing well. It does feel a little bit separate to the Wii U thing.
Now you're very down on the old VR roller coasters. I quite like them. Like I have played a horror VR roller coaster that I really liked on the Gear. This thing where you walk on a tightrope, I think looks quite fun, although it feels like maybe that would be better as a sort of Vive thing where it's a bit more aware of where your body is. But I guess this kind of thing is going to be very short-lived. Like, it's the most basic form of, most sort of overtly novelty form of VR. Is it a good thing for Sony to be getting involved with?
I don't know how well Move did. I mean, we always talk about Kinect in terms of just being a product that did really well, despite the fact that it failed to revolutionize gaming. And if Sony get that from this VR thing, they'll be very happy, I think. They one of the things I like about Sony is they really go in with both barrels. They jump in with both feet, no matter what they're doing. So they really try and do everything for at least 6 months anyway. They try and make whatever they're working on the biggest thing they're doing. So I think that leads to lots of really nice products, and I'm really glad they're doing a VR thing. But yeah, no, I'm still very much on the side of not expecting it to be an important part of PlayStation 5.
One final trend I'd like to draw out of this is the kind of sort of these big tier indie games that we're seeing. If you look at Boundless, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Wild, these are all games about sort of and No Man's Sky. In fact, these are games about exploring very big, sort of in some instances procedurally generated environments with lots of creatures. So No Man's Sky has these generative creatures. Boundless has these kind of funny enemies wandering around all these parallel universes. Horizon Zero Dawn has these big kind of Shadow of the Colossus style dinosaurs. And Wild is about interacting with animals. So it seems like the way that the consoles have taken this like big expansive survival environment thing is to kind of add this exploration component onto kind of more traditional third-person games. It's kind of a weird trend.
Yeah, we need to wait and see how that goes. I mean, I still think that a crucial part of the survival games is the fact that it's actually really hard to survive. And it's difficult to work out how exploration fits in. I think exploration is really important. I'm not particularly on board with the idea of exploration being the primary mechanism. That feels like a very, very different kind of game. So it's interesting that they're all doing things at the same time, and you've recognised a pattern there. None of those games excite me very much.
Yeah.
And that's kind of true again of most of these. They feel like big budget, sort of versions, less interesting versions of these big indie hits, which is not really where I want to see them going. But again, maybe I'm just in a bad mood today.
I'm happy that No Man's Sky is taking a big chunk of time. There were lots of rumours about it sort of stealth releasing around now, and I'm pleased they've set this really far off date of next June. If anything, a game like that is going to need a lot of polishing at the end, and maybe some sort of grinding into gear at the end, perhaps. So that's good. I'm glad that they've got time to do that and they're not being kind of held to any weird console announcements or anything like that. That's good. Wild, I think, is interesting. This idea of playing as different animals and kind of changing what animal you are. I think what the consoles can do now is they can do realistic settings quite well, and it's sort of nice to see something that's a bit of a break from like big robots or sci-fi. But also Wild sort of has these kind of like very traditional gamey elements creeping in that seem to kind of cause it to be stuck in its sort of old game tropes. So I don't know if we're going to break out of tradition with this new stuff, really.
Yeah, I didn't see anything particularly like revolutionary from my perspective, and I think the console makers are still trying to work out what their relationship with Steam games is, and I don't mean porting, I mean just like what PC gaming is like, what games on the PC are like, and I think consoles are really trying to work out how to subsume that, how to be different from that, how they want to absolutely emulate that beyond just porting a bunch of games. They haven't worked it out, and I kind of I'm a little bit down on a lot of these games, but I guess what will happen is that one or two of them will be great in a way that they kind of couldn't have been great if they were an indie game on the PC, or even necessarily any game on the PC. Sometimes it requires the kind of personality you get from a big budget console game to push something over the edge in a certain direction, and that's definitely what we're missing. And it's that kind of personality that often turns me off, but when it actually hits for me, it does really, really well. And I'm kind of thinking about the kind of stuff that Rare were often able to bring to their games. So it's kind of been a really long time coming, and maybe in this time in a year, or maybe in 18 months, we'll be able to point at what the defining games of this generation of consoles are, because they're not here yet.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think PS4 really is showing a lot of potential at the moment, but you're completely right. We don't know which of these games are going to hit. We still don't know much about how a lot of them are going to really play. So it will pan out soon. It'll be interesting. Quake Live has dropped its free-to-play model and become a normal pay-once game on Steam. This comes roughly a year after they moved away from the browser-based origins of the game. Unfortunately, by dropping their own user account system and using Steamworks instead, they've had to reset all their player statistics, which I believe is for 5 years, and that's understandably left some people rather upset. Does this illuminate anything about free-to-play generally, or is it specific to Quake Live?
I guess it's mainly specific. This is all rather boggling to me, I have to say. It's not surprising they moved away from browsers. I think we can definitively say that people don't want to play like 3D games in browsers. I think we've had enough tries at that, and people just don't want to do it. That's interesting in itself, but that's a segment for another podcast than this one. The thing that I find most surprising about this thing about the in-game statistics being wiped just sounds like they're being lazy to me, because I'm sure you could find some way of moving them across if you really wanted to. If the data's there, it can be put in any format you'd like. The thing that really surprised me about this is that they're in a slightly similar move to the Payday 2 thing we were talking about last week. They seem to be trying to add Team Fortress 2 and CSGO style skins, I believe. And if that's the case, I wonder why they would do that at the same time as making it pay once.
Yes.
Which is very strange to me. And I mean, maybe again it's about trying to fund the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
But, you know, I won't say it's only specific to this game. I think a big game like this, moving back from free-to-play to pay once, is kind of a big deal.
So I think this definitely indicates that they're having a problem with their business model in general. It means that they're not able to do the work on it that they want to, or perhaps that they want to stop working on it and kind of sunset the game and then move it into a sort of low-rent ongoing phase. And I just wonder if this is actually the right way of doing that, given that they've managed to cause this enormous community upset. It's been so weird to see this in the context of that Payday 2 thing, when this is kind of literally the opposite direction.
Yeah, I can't imagine it's like doing amazing numbers, otherwise it would seem weird to make this big of a change.
Yeah.
So in some ways, in their minds, it may not matter too much what they do, because as far as they're concerned, it must be currently, I guess failure is the wrong word, but just like right now, not anything that's exciting to them, so they want to try something else. I hope that at some point in the future we get post-mortem on all of this, because I'd love to hear what they actually think about stuff like the browser-based stuff, what it was like when it was free-to-play. But the whole thing smacks a little bit of them not having gone fully in on it.
Yeah.
You know, it just makes complete sense to have done much earlier Team Fortress 2, CSGO style stuff with this. I think they must have a very small amount invested in it, a very small team. And given that, you know, anything they might do may not be successful because they're not invested enough.
I suppose one other argument for this is that free-to-play works best when you have a big, vibrant community, especially with aesthetic items. There's lots of trends, there's competition for different kinds of items, and so on. And if the community is dwindling a bit, which I suspect it probably is, I mean, CS is so dominant in this space. Now, I know CS and Quake attract different kinds of gamers, and people are very partisan with their esports, but it's got to be impactful on some level. There are these enormous high-profile CS tournaments, and Quake Live is very sidelined. So this might just be a sensible reaction to a very low community number, I guess.
Sure, when nothing much is happening for you, making a big change is a totally cool thing to do. Again, does this take them out of the running for being an esport, though? Because if being an esport is anywhere near the top of your priorities list, you probably wouldn't suddenly make it a pay-once thing.
I think that Quake Live is probably set now in terms of its esports prominence, which is really not very much. I mean, I believe that there is still a scene and there's still tournaments and so on, but I don't think it's going to come up to challenge, you know, any of the major esports meaningfully. Quake was just a late 90s thing, and that seems to be something that they need to accept now.
Yeah, I see a lot of games announced nowadays, and they talk about one of their primary goals being an esport, and it still seems like a very dangerous thing to rely on. You know, being an esport is going to be a symptom of having a great game that lots of people love, and if you're taking that as a given, you know, for your unreleased game, then that's a pretty big step. And given that, I'm not sure that that's the right time at which to put a load of money into the esports aspect. I mean, certainly if you're Blizzard, the maths is different on that. But for almost anyone else, I think it's a problematic thing to be assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're making a sequel to a big game, if you're Valve, you're making Dota 2, if you're Blizzard, you know that there's going to be that need early on, and you need to have players and the esports community involved really heavily early on. You need to put the features in. I think stuff like Blizzard's integration with the GameHeart UI, which is a much better caster UI, and some of the stuff they facilitated around that later on was absolutely critical. You can't let these things molder. But doing it up front, I think, is almost completely crazy. And we saw this this yesterday with some of Sony's sort of forced esports stuff where they put commentary on things and so on. That always rings very, very false, and it turns people off. It turns people off both from within esports and outside it, because it kind of reflects something that people see as a negative side of esports, which is this kind of sports bro-esque shouting that nobody wants. So, yeah.
Right, exactly. Again, being a successful esport is something that happens down the line, or, as you say, part of being a sequel. This stuff makes me just remember how Quake's kind of a non-entity now, and in some ways, id have fallen a long way, and they're, I'm interested to see what they next do in terms of trying to become like super relevant again. Quake was a huge deal for a very long period of time. Just selfishly, I would love to see them, instead of continuing to piss about with Quake Live, trying to make Quake 1 live, like trying to make that an esport, trying to do the Team Fortress 2 thing with that, because I love Quake 1 a lot more than I love Quake 3, and that would probably get a lot more attention. I think you do kind of run out of PR sort of credit after a certain time with a game, and I'm pretty sure Quake 3 is there.
Yeah. I mean, they've got this new Doom game coming out, which I think people have been very positive on early on. It's supposed to be much more sort of shooter-like, much more traditional shooter-like, so I guess that's where their sort of trad gameplay stuff is going, rather than Quake 1, which I agree would be a great thing to bring back. I mean, at the moment, the shooter focus in terms of esports is around stuff like Overwatch and Lawbreakers, and there was another one in the Sony presentation, the name of which absolutely escapes me because all of these games are the fucking same. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Like, there's this kind of cluster around this like MOBA FPS esports thing that is that going to go anywhere? I don't know. I just have absolutely no idea.
Me either. Let's keep an eye on it.
The US Library of Congress have granted certain exceptions to the controversial DMCA, which makes the circumvention of DRM legal in certain circumstances. Now, one of these circumstances is the preservation of video games. Players are being allowed to remove authentication checks if the original server has been shut down, and libraries and museums are allowed to jailbreak consoles as well for the purposes of showing these games. Now, a usual legal caveat, stuff around EULAs and DRM tends to be incredibly badly reported, even by very well-meaning journalists, and we haven't delved completely into this, so some of this may not be literally true, but let's discuss it as if that were the case. Is the law starting to catch up with the reality of the games industry?
That's quite a hard question to answer because, on the one hand, making it easier for museums to be able to have console games on display, which often involves needing to jailbreak the console or the game, seems like a very good thing and seems in some ways a very important step. On the other hand, making it legal to hack your own games if people turning off the servers have made the entire game unplayable, quite specifically, not if it's only the multiplayer, if it's made the whole single player as well unplayable, seems like, less than relevant, because the user, the end user, is not going to be worried about the DMCA when he's hacking his own game, and it's such like an arbitrary point, and it doesn't really do anything, and it doesn't really feel like a gateway to anything else for me. So, it's nice to see this. I'm kind of surprised to see such a, in some ways, granular kind of addition to this law. So I guess we should celebrate this, but it just seems like largely irrelevant.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything you've said. I think it's completely moot. Nobody, if you're able to do this, which is one thing that, isn't necessarily the case, if you're able to hack out the authentication, no one cares about the law. And because if a games company, sued someone over this, it would be the greatest furore of all time. You shut down the server and then you sue some 14-year-old hacker for patching out this, that's crazy. That would never happen. So,
sounds like a good episode of Law and Order.
Right, totally. So this is kind of silly. I mean, yes, if we're making provisions about preserving games history and so on, then that's really cool. Like, what a great thing for the law to be doing. That's incredibly important culturally, and not just for the games industry, but for culture as a whole. You've got to preserve stuff that people do. Otherwise, you just end up repeating the past all the time. So I think that's really good. But yeah, like you say, I mean, there's nothing really to be said here. I think it's kind of not going to affect anything directly.
Yeah, I think it's kind of amazing the idea that there were some museums breaking the law before today because they put a special chip in a SNES or something because they desperately wanted Contra 3 to be playable. You know, I'm really glad that's not the case anymore. But again, like, that's why I'm kind of so boggled by this. It sort of seems like so minor as to be exactly the kind of thing that you wouldn't respond to as the governing body, but also the response they have is so underwhelming. It really reminds me of the NCAA in college sports. Sometimes they'll do these tiny little things to try and, you know, do better with public favour, but like the overwhelming response is just like, everything about this is broken. I'm not interested in you rearranging deck chairs on your personal Titanic, and that's kind of how I feel about this.
I want to go to the museum that is just exclusively comprised of like 2002 to 2005 era mobile games, and they have to have like all of the different handsets that they bought from a newsagent just kind of arrayed. That's who this is for, and I support that entirely.
I would love to see that museum. That sounds like a horrible thing to try and do.
PC Gamer has an article about the most overpowered items ever to appear in games. It leads off with the infamous Fortify Intelligence Potion from Morrowind, which I believe contributes heavily to the hilarious Morrowind speedruns, and also includes such gems as the Dirty Diaper from Ultima. In this era of balance, Ian Hardingham, should we celebrate the overpowered item even more?
Yeah, we definitely should. This is a great article.
Yes.
I encourage you readers to go check it out because I clicked on this expecting to get a bunch of boring entries about the nukes in Fallout, and there was only one entry really like that about the nukes in Fallout, and actually it's a lot of really intelligent stuff. So well done, PC Gamer. Get a clap from me. Very excited by this. Yeah, I think we need to focus on the Dirty Diaper for just a second.
We do.
From Ultima 7. This is a I guess a weapon that you can activate, you can load by getting a baby to poo in it, which now I'm starting to talk about this, it just sounds like it's a bit of a social problem. Anyway, and once you've done that, if you throw it at any enemy, they become dazed for quite a long period of time. So it's got the best combination of being completely ridiculous, slightly offensive, and being definitely overpowered. So this is all great, and really, again, like a lot of times, your favorite games are fully systemic games, which allow everything to be governed by the same rule set, and that's the kind of game where you get really amazingly overpowered stuff that's still really exciting. And I think all like true PC gamers have at least a couple of games from their past where that's been like a facet of it, and it's just a really, really awesome part of it. So seeing this memorialized in this article is really great. I mean, they talk about the rocket launcher from Quake 1 because that's the weapon that introduced rocket jumping, and like in some ways that's not particularly overpowered. It just kind of disrupted the game because suddenly you're able to get to places the level designers weren't expecting, and it was just like one of the best emergent things that's ever happened. So I think like when you just start focusing on things that break games in interesting ways, those are just some of the most interesting things to explore.
Right, absolutely, and that's definitely the more kind of intelligent end of this. I also like they've got Dr. Boom from Hearthstone, which is a legendarily OP Hearthstone card, and certainly in those games, people have these fond memories of the sort of evil past when things were really OP. The same happened in StarCraft 2 with Reapers early on. Reapers are a unit that can jump up cliffs, and in the first beta they were incredibly powerful. So the game just consisted only of Reaper rushes, and that kind of, these things bring back a certain era. And for those older games that never got patched, I think the most evocative thing was like, oh hey, do you remember this stupid weapon?
Yeah, and tying into that, you know, you mentioned this card from Hearthstone. And it's a 7-mana card, and again, I don't know anywhere near as much about Hearthstone as I do about Magic, and I don't know that much about either. But as soon as you're getting into the level of 7-mana cards, you're already in the late game, really, at that point. And once you get to sort of 8 and 9 and 10-mana cards, certainly in Magic, it tends to kind of just be, you know, what kind of weird, overpowered thing can we make? Because once you get there, if you're survived that long, then you're running an effective deck that's that long, running that long a game, and it kind of doesn't matter. So I think it's cool to include Dr. Boom. I mean, to be honest, if they're including a card that hasn't been banned, that's sort of almost counter to the idea of the article, because this is a card that can be played in apparently any competitive deck because it's just such a good card. It's just the best 7-mana card, and that's so much less important than the best 2-mana card. And And in general, yeah, there's a real conflict between things that actually break the game, and those are the kind of things that will get nerfed, and then stuff which is just a bunch of late game stuff.
Yeah.
You know, if you get this thing called Satellite Rain from Syndicate Wars, which is just a massively powerful satellite weapon that sort of destroys half the level, the rules are kind of turned off once you get that late into a game. It's all about the developers pissing around and doing something really crazy that's really exciting to people who've bothered to play that far. And that's like a very different thing to say the knife gloves from Dead Rising 2, which were sort of traditionally overpowered. They're very easy to get very early on, and they're kind of just much better than every other weapon, and that's much more of a problematic thing in a game.
I did think the writing in this is particularly good, and just before we leave this, I'd like to return to Dr. Boom. It's Richard Cobbett, of course, and he says, the card is playable in literally any Hearthstone deck, and has consequently earned itself nicknames like Dr. Balance, Dr. 7, because everyone plays him immediately on turn 7, and less prosaically, Dr. Cancer. So the community reactions to these things are always good. I like how they're enshrined in myth. And yes, as you point out, this is currently still in the game, and you've got to have these things. This article seems like a bit of a political platform to use in order to shame Dr. Boom for his current state, certainly for his cost. And that's great. Like, I think players need a target of their ire. You've got to have some OP things.
You got to, and poor Dr. Boom. I think we'll leave this with the idea, if you want to make something legendary in lore, you should definitely call it Doctor something, because it just makes it easier for these commentators to come up with somewhat amusing meme entries.
Dr. Balance is pretty good. Bethesda are partnering with Carlsberg to produce Fallout branded beer. You can pre-order a case of 12 on Amazon now for £30 and have them delivered a few days before the release of Fallout 4 early next month. Ian Hardingham, could their choice of beer partner be any more disappointing?
Well, I think, Budweiser might be worse.
I guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out which way to go on this. Basic Carlsberg is not the most exciting beer on the planet. I mean, it is beer, so I will drink it if there's nothing else to drink. I guess this will be something a little different. They're saying it's got a refreshingly zesty, hoppy taste and a floral aroma, which not even the most excited PR person could describe normal Carlsberg like. So I'm really hoping this will be something different. And obviously, Carlsberg do make a lot of beers that aren't Carlsberg. This is cool. I mean, like, I would definitely get a case of this. It's quite expensive.
Yeah.
Getting like a case of 330ml bottles for 30 quid is quite a lot. On the other hand, I'm probably going to get one, so maybe it's not mispriced.
I think that they should have gone the craft route, and it should have been like 3 Dogs Megaton Death Bottle, Nuka Bottle, and they should have, because it's just Fallout. It doesn't even have a cool name.
Fallout beer is kind of the most boring thing you could possibly have called this.
Yeah. It should have.
So I'm not terribly impressed by that. But, this is what happens when you have a successful mobile game. Just so we're clear, this is exactly the fallout, every pun intended, of having like a massively successful crossover hit with your ridiculous mobile game. So I feel, again, very unclear on how I feel about it. Because if this is the gateway to a lot of proper microbrew game-related beers, then I'm all in. But if this is just going to be like the thing that kills that idea, I'm not all in. So Carlsberg, this better be good.
Jed Pressgrove penned an article on the subject of gore at Paste magazine. Quite an interesting article this, kind of ranges around a few different things. Doesn't like Hotline Miami 2 very much. I recommend reading this, it's good. Ian Hardingham, has games' relationship with gore changed over time?
I'm not particularly sure it has, and I'm not particularly sure this article wasn't too intelligent for me. It's really quite like a high-level criticism, and yeah, I was also taken by the bizarre hyperbole it used to criticise Hotline Miami, and I think it was implicated that it wasn't just the second one, but the first one as well. This guy didn't particularly like.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, gore's weird. I mean, I don't know what to say. I don't know about the visceral feelings you get from seeing gore. I mean, the first time you play Doom and you can go and shoot people in the face with a shotgun, that's a pretty big deal because that's an experience you haven't had before. Certainly for me, it got a lot less exciting once it was in everything. and I think this article mainly focuses on games which really super emphasize the gore, like Hotline Miami and Mortal Kombat, both games which are really kind of in some ways sold on that.
Yeah.
And those are the games that I find it least interesting to discuss on this level. If you're going to have a game which pays all of its attention to one thing like that, I'm totally fine with that. You're going to get some interesting irony, interesting commentary. You're going to make people feel you're going to make people examine their own feelings to a much higher degree when you do that than when you just have very sort of casual massive gore as you do in other games. I mean, it's not an area that I feel particularly strongly about. I don't want to play or whatever that Rockstar game was, the really super violent one, Manhunter, I think.
Yeah.
I've got no interest in playing those things, just like I have no interest in watching so-called torture porn. It's just not for me. And I also don't think it's particularly a social evil. I just kind of don't think it's all that impactful. So it was interesting to read this, but it didn't kind of trigger any massive opinions from me.
Gore is an interesting one because it's so incredibly subjective. Basically, there's I think violence is worse than gore, kind of inherently morally, I guess aesthetically worse, I suppose, if you can use those.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Right, because gore is just the pink bits inside things, and you can look at them.
It's the decision to kill someone is much more meaningful than the decision to kill them by ripping out their spine and then playing tennis with it, or whatever Mortal Kombat does.
Right, exactly. So there's that aspect to it. I mean, if you look at it was really interesting for me. I think I've mentioned this on the show before, watching Mortal Kombat as an esport, and then sort of seeing the ridiculous fatalities at the end, and sometimes they'd show them, and often they just happen in the background, and people would kind of ignore them. And there's some of the stuff in Mortal Kombat 10 is just unbelievable, like the level of detail and time they've put into these things where you slice through the guy's head and there's a cross section of his neck, and then it's just completely insane. But I agree with you, it's that's because it's about that in some way. They focused on that as an aesthetic thing they want to do, and it's just a bit boring. Like anything that has an obsession that you're not interested in, you just find a bit sort of alienating and odd. And whether teenagers like that a lot now in the same way we liked Mortal Kombat 1 when that came out because it was naughty, it was kind of cartoon gore, and it was a cartoon of someone pulling someone's head off. It's funny when your parents are talking to you a lot about these games are bad, here's a game that is actually doing these terrible things that people kind of think that are in games, and that was why it was cool. But
young people like subversive stuff,
right.
Massive Shock, really. And there's a lot more subversive than having a huge amount of blood spurt out of weird body regions when you kill them. I think that I think that this for me it's part of gaming culture, and because of its sort of slightly more juvenile roots, or certainly a lot of genres have that element, and I'm sure a lot of people would say that they're desperate to get away from that part of games culture. But it is definitely a part of games culture. One of the easiest things to do is to make your game a bit more sexy by pushing the gore up to 11, because once you've got the particle effect for blood, you can just increase the number. And it doesn't really cost you anything. And I just don't have a problem with it. I don't think it's toxic in the way that some sexism and racism is, or all sexism and racism is in games. I think that the violence and gore stuff is just kind of part of the general culture, may be the wrong word, but just the history of it. And there are always going to be games that play on that. And I just don't have a massive problem with that.
Gamasutra interviewed Magic the Gathering creator Richard Garfield recently. Some interesting stuff in this. I liked his thoughts about the complexity budget for a game, where you have a certain amount of allowed complexity and you have to think about how different features use up the budget. Did this accord with your own game design experience in any way, and does it throw any light on Magic for you?
I also really enjoyed this, and also the specific bit that you mentioned. I was surprised to hear that he, after designing the original release of Magic, went on to making Netrunner and Robo Rally, both really excellent games. If we can focus on this this complexity budget for a second, that's much more of a core gameplay / paper game thing.
Yeah. So
when you're talking about the basic platforming of Mario, or you're talking about playing a board game, it's definitely a massive deal. And I was really interested to hear about how he was trying to weigh up a new feature in terms of how good it was versus how complex it was, and understanding that he would only have a certain amount of complexity to put in, which is a really interesting way of looking at things. The games that I tend to design tend to be quite pared down anyway, so I don't tend to have too much of a problem with that. And when you start looking at the way in which computer games are divorced from that is when you start looking at meta structure, single player structure, that tends to be a very different matter, because that's kind of a different part of the game playing brain than like the combat in a Final Fantasy game or the combat in Frozen Synapse. But hearing a guy who's obviously really Hall of Fame worthy, Hall of Fame game designer, talk in a really cogent fashion, he's a really good interview. He talked very concisely about a lot of interesting topics. But it sort of made me examine the differences between making board games, card games, versus computer games. It's such a different skill at a lot of levels, and board game and card game design should inform your micro, your combat in an RPG game, but not sort of much beyond that. So I was massively inspired reading it, but I haven't really kind of processed it a lot yet.
Yeah, you're right. It does have a very strong mechanics focus, and I guess that is a lot more prevalent in board games because the aesthetic stuff is basically just words and pictures, and I guess to some extent, the way the game is framed, but it's hugely more limited when compared to a computer game or a digital game. I think that he said some really interesting stuff about Magic. He said that what would happen in early playtest was that people would play the game a lot and they'd complain the entire time they were playing it, but then they'd want to play it again. And I've definitely had that experience with a load of different games. Like the sort of perceived flaws of it come to the fore very much early on, and you have all these niggling problems. But the only thing you want to do is kind of play it again and figure out sort of what you think about those problems more and focus on the bits of it that you like. So I did think that was very cogent.
Yeah, I mean, it rings completely true, and it reminds me of the first time we had Frozen Synapse play tested, and it reminds me about the things Blizzard was saying about Diablo 1.
Yeah.
The most important piece of good feedback you can have is if people want to keep playing, and it sounds really obvious, but it's really easy to forget it when it's not happening.
Yes.
And kind of knowing how to respond when it's not happening is one of the greatest skills in making games, I think.
Wow. Psyonix are adding mutators to Rocket League. Soon, when creating a match, you'll be able to turn on special rule sets such as low gravity, much like in the old Unreal Tournament games. Is this a good thing for Rocket League?
I don't think it's a bad thing for Rocket League. I mean, it's still amazing quite how pared down Rocket League is as a game.
Yep.
And I think adding a bunch of modes is cool, and I don't think it's gonna schism the community. I don't think half of the community are gonna refuse to play anything that isn't with a giant puck as opposed to a ball. And mutators are inherently cool. It's nice to hear that the designers of Rocket League were massive Unreal Tournament fans, and that's was one of the biggest inspirations to them when making this game. I sort of recently stopped playing Rocket League because it's such a it's just such a competitive game, and it's such a sort of a one-note game that it's kind of, once I vaguely got out of the zone, I wasn't that excited about getting back in the zone. This doesn't especially make me want to do that more. I think I'd be more interested if it had like a much more fleshed out single player. But I'm never against mutators. Mutators are really cool.
So I'm gonna take the opposite side of this, I think. I'm gonna come out as a Rocket League conservative. I really like the way Rocket League is now. I love the pared down nature of it. The way I started playing it is, when we both started playing it, I was playing a lot of singles and doubles, and now I pretty much only play 3v3 because I want it to be my more relaxing game, and I feel like my level is okay, that I can contribute to a fairly low level game without annoying everyone, and that's fine, and I'm happy with that, and I use it as my relaxation game away from Smash, which I'm actively trying to get better in. So I want to just make sure that that is okay, and when I saw this I was like, ooh, maybe the casual players will move on to these weird things and I'll have to kind of try and play some of them and like learn new stuff, and I don't want that. I want my bread and butter Rocket League, so I guess I'm a bit worried.
Yeah, I've got a lot of time for that. I don't think that's like a crazy opinion or anything. I think maybe one of the reasons that I'm sort of mildly on board with this is that I'm still looking for there to be more to Rocket League. I still want it to be more like Tribes 2, which seems like a weird thing to want, but it is nonetheless what I want. So I kind of romanticize the idea of a sort of a slightly bigger experience. But sure, I mean, when I think about Rocket League now, my emotion about it is that it's just a bit of a dry experience, and I guess I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of there being a little less dryness to it. But having said that, this doesn't make me want to go back and play it anymore.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not as successful with me.
I think the thing that you said about Tribes, which was really interesting, was the positional thing, that you could choose to play a specific position and some were more skill-based than others. And that definitely is a problem with Rocket League. I would be interested in playing a mode where you start in the same formation every time, so someone's always in goal. And I guess that kind of goes against what I said about mutators, but I kind of like that to be in the main rotation. I guess I have a sort of inherent distrust of things in games that are not the main thing. Like, I will play the standard difficulty most prominent mode in almost all games, and I think I just want to be part of what the kind of essential thing is about the game, really.
Yeah, and I'm not a million miles away from that. I mean, when I was growing up, it was just games were mainly about single-player stuff, and I would get together with my friends and play LAN games every month or 2 months. And we just enjoy playing all these weird modes. So I still connect with games whenever I think about anything, really in the single-player aspects. And I think about how much I would like these mutators if I was playing single-player the whole time. So in some ways, I'm just a bit past it when trying to connect with this just on a multiplayer thing, because I don't want to go and play tennis with a low-gravity mod. Like, that's not exciting to me. But if tennis was a single-player experience, then I might want to. So, yeah, it's pretty individual, I think.
Fans are upset after Nintendo of America included an old meme joke in their translation of the new portable Zelda game Triforce Heroes. Interestingly, the European version of the game does not include this joke, meaning that the game is translated to English twice. Now, this is a variation on the Doge meme, or Doge, however you want to correctly or incorrectly pronounce that, where a character says something like "such castle, such atmosphere," or something along those lines. Ian Hardingham, should all your memes not belong in games?
Yeah, right. So I say Doge. I understand that probably the most interesting thing about this meme is how you pronounce it. The thing that the American version of this Zelda spin-off says, here's the piece of dialogue: "Still, coming here has at least afforded me the rare chance to explore these ancient ruins. So ancient. Such ruin." Let me address this specifically. I think that's really pretty unoffensive. Like, that's definitely a Doge meme, without a doubt, if you know what that meme is. On the other hand, if you play this in 10 years, and let's all hope that the Doge meme no longer exists in 10 years, I don't think you'd think like that was massively out of place. You'd just be like, oh, well, that's another slightly weird bit of Nintendo translated dialogue. I don't think it's massively out of aesthetic for what Zelda games kind of are.
Yeah.
I'm trying to imagine, like if the next Thief game wasn't a travesty and had a Doge meme in it, I'd be pretty upset. So I definitely have some time for the people who are upset. But I guess I'm just not that much of a current Zelda fan.
This is really weird. I feel a whole load of different things about this. I mean, firstly, that's kind of crappy writing, let's be honest. I mean, it's not funny, and it's kind of crappy. And so there's that. Also, the reference doesn't really make sense. Like, it's a throwaway gag. It has absolutely no other purpose than to be a throwaway gag, and it doesn't really function that well as one, so I find it difficult to defend it on that basis. By the same token, as you say, it's not obvious. Like, it doesn't have the picture of the thing, which, let's face it, would be probably funnier and more amazing if that just appeared. It doesn't.
Maybe that's in the final chest at the end of the dungeon.
That would be good. Also, this is kind of an irreverent game, and it's playing around with the IP. I mean, I haven't played this game. I guess it's sort of a little bit similar to the Mario and Luigi stuff. That it's kind of on the edge. It's not really canon. So
yeah, and let's not forget like the Twinkle's Magic Ball Sack or whatever the weird like Zelda spin-off game that had, was his name Twinkle or Twinkie?
Tingle.
Dingle, right?
Tingle,
really,
not Tingle.
Whatever. I mean, he was pretty offensive to start with. So this is a series that's already willing to kind of go off limits, and like I'm much more offended. I'm sorry to do this. I'm much more offended by how Zelda games look nowadays. These 2D Zelda games, because I really enjoyed the pixel art of like the SNES versions, and now it just looks very sort of. I'm afraid it just looks a bit boring to me personally. So that offends me much more than the idea of using this weird meme. So yeah, I guess it's not wonderful.
No, I'm sorry, I just lost it with Dingle, and then the fact that you turned this somehow into a graphical hobby horse again.
I will talk about how I'm just looking at this screenshot. I'm just telling you how I emotionally react. Lucky you.
Boy Boing have published a guide on how to play chess like an asshole. Mostly this seems to consist of playing in a manner that seems weak and reckless, but is designed to provoke your opponent into making easily exploitable mistakes. My favourite opening in this is called the Bong Cloud, which is a really good name. I like the style of it as well. Do we see much deliberate bad play in other competitive forms, or is this kind of thing quite unique to chess?
Yeah, so this is basically about hustling, right?
Yeah.
This is basically about making an opening. Obviously, openings are huge deals in chess. That starts off looking like you're a complete noob, and at some point involves a quite sophisticated trap. I guess it's like cheesing, although I don't know. You can tell me the extent to which cheesing can look like just someone has no idea what they're doing. Before being like a trap. I like how chess is trying to catch up with pro gaming. It's trying to use a lot of pro gaming-esque terms to make it a bit more sexy. And while I have a lot of time for chess, I think chess is obviously an absolutely amazing game. I was trying to look at all of these openings that this article talks about, and just kind of realizing that I have no idea how to analyze a chessboard anymore, and kind of how dry chess is. But I'm sure this is really exciting to people who are really into chess. Yeah, I don't know how much this happens in other esports. How much hustling is there?
It's interesting that you say that this is hard to kind of pass, because it just made me realise how hard it is to pass in everything. Like, if you showed someone this in Hearthstone or StarCraft or whatever, it would be really difficult for them to understand why it's good. And I do wonder.
Yeah, that's true.
I do wonder if there are ever ways of kind of exposing that stuff in a more accessible way that's sort of less rooted in all the terminology and so on. I think that in terms of your question, like, in cheese, is there an element of hustling? There are in some kinds of cheese in StarCraft, but I think it's quite rare. That this kind of thing actually happens a lot more when the game develops a bit. Players will show tech that implies they're going down a certain route, or they'll show a unit and then they'll be doing something else. So it kind of manifests more as bluffing. But there are forms of cheese that kind of just make it look like you're bad. The problem is at high-level competitive games, like, you know the other person isn't bad, so you know they're going to be doing something weird. There is an example in this article, though, of a grandmaster doing something that just looks really weird. And that definitely happens. You can sort of show something odd to throw your opponent off, but I think that's less about sort of looking like you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I guess part of this is game specific. How possible is it to put your opponent in a truly terrible position before they've realised you're hustling? Now, I reckon that in StarCraft 2, that's almost impossible if you're like a much worse player, because you're probably going to be able to micro out of it once you realise that your opponent's hustling you. Whereas obviously in chess, you can get to the point where you basically won before they've realised, and it's also a question of how much does knowing how good your opponent is play into how you play the game.
Yeah.
Certainly in chess and certainly in poker, it's incredibly important to know how good your opponent is in terms of just how you play, and it's certainly true in bridge as well, because you just need to know whether the card they've just played could be them being an idiot, or whether it's giving you loads of information. The better your opponent is, the more information you can get from what they're doing. And that's a really important thing, and games differ in how important that is. And I reckon my idea of StarCraft is that it's kind of a game where you can possibly more easily tell the difference between someone who's scouting for a specific build or just scouting because they're an idiot.
Yeah.
You can back me up on that. Whereas in something like the card games, I think it's much harder, and goodness knows how the first-person shooters play into this. So that's kind of like a big aspect to a game.
Yeah, you can definitely see how good a ladder opponent is at StarCraft pretty quickly, unless it's some really elaborate thing, and really, really elaborate things probably won't ever work more than 50% of the time anyway. I mean, there were some kind of quite devastating, like, ladder-only cheese builds that people would do that were unexpected, didn't really make sense in the metagame, but were really powerful at a certain time. And doing that kind of thing, I think, is possibly one way you could win while disguising your ability, but StarCraft is kind of a weird game, particularly as how long games of StarCraft tend to be, even the short ones. In Smash, there's this idea of conditioning, where you will repeatedly do a certain thing so your opponent expects you to do it again, and then you do something else. And I've certainly seen that happen with very bad players, that they will kind of overly respond to what you do, and then you can use that to beat them. I guess that's the kind of flip side of that. You can do things to detect whether someone's bad, and then use that to punish them. But yeah, I do feel like this is actually quite unique to chess, and it might be to do with just how powerful openings are in chess, how you have to kind of infer everything about your opponent from their opening. I guess that might be unique to chess.
Yeah, and openings in chess are crazy because they're so dependent on what the opponent does, and you've got to have the right reactions, like the kind of the sideboards or the sub moves, depending on what your opponent might do, and that's pretty weird. Again, like I guess in StarCraft 2, you get set on your build, and there's only a limited amount of, in inverted commas, sideboarding you can do. I mean, again, just to talk about how important it is to know how good your opponent is. It's just so unbelievably crucial in poker. I can't think of another game where it's anything like as important. Because when you start to have a game that's all about bluffing, you've really got to have a good read on what a bluff would mean to your opponent. The better you get, the kind of the narrower the range of what bluffs actually might be are. And it's all on such a knife edge anyway. But yeah, maybe we can explore other pro games and try and work out like how hardcore they are. As soon as you start getting a really super complicated game, certainly like an FPS like CS:GO, it's so open, it's so about micro that you lose a lot of this stuff. And again, talk about Synapse. A lot of Synapse's design was about trying to capture some of this stuff. People talk in Synapse about it being very important to them to know how good their opponent is. And I remember putting in features to enable that, because when I was playing Synapse at the beginning, I would just play in a completely different way, whether it was a noob or a high-level guy. So, just a lot more facets of pro sports gaming.
Synapse is interesting because you really need to know what the optimal play is in every situation in order to do good variation. So if you're trying to bluff or trying to trap someone, you absolutely need to know what the correct thing would have been to do. And I think that's quite similar to poker in a lot of ways. And quite a few games don't have that, but I guess in Synapse it's quite perhaps easier to identify the directly optimal thing to do than it is in other games.
Yeah, and possibly Cortex even more than that.
Yeah.
Is your opponent going to be playing the best move, or do you have the opportunity to try and shortcut the game by exposing their actual weakness?
There's no Ian's Magic Corner today, but we move on to quite a relevant topic in Paul's Smash Corner. So I wanted to take one aspect of Smash and use it to talk about a general kind of gameplay issue. So I was thinking about the relationship of error in Smash to the different levels of play, and this really ties into what we were just talking about. And I've defined two different kinds of errors. There's strategic error, where you basically don't know what you should be doing, and that can manifest itself in a match as getting grabbed a lot, which is pretty much terrible for any character. You shouldn't allow yourself to be grabbed, particularly by characters that have very powerful combos from grabs. You should be able to know when that is and avoid it. Usually means you're blocking too much or you're turtling too much. Another strategic error is not DIing correctly or or at all. This can tie into execution errors, but DI is basically where you input a direction as you're being hit, and it takes your trajectory a certain way. And a lot of it's very strategic, like you should know where to DI from certain moves against certain characters, and if you don't know about DI, that's a very good way of flagging you up as a bad player. Another kind of strategic error is attacking too much, kind of the opposite of being grabbed too much. In Smash 4, you shouldn't throw out too many moves. It leaves you very, very vulnerable. You can really tell a bad player by the fact that they will often play aggressively, and that can catch you by surprise. It's another way that a bad player can beat a good player, is that you shouldn't be attacking too much, so when you do, it's surprising. So that's strategic error. Then, of course, there's execution error, which is not really very interesting. It's just micro. Things like mistiming your attacks so that they whiff, giving your opponent an opportunity to hit you. Things like mistiming ledge grabs as well. The ledge game in Smash is very important, trying to get back onto the stage, and if you don't execute those things correctly, you can often lose an entire round. So my thoughts were really, player error really matters a lot. If you watch a pro match, there will be instances where the pros don't tech correctly, they don't get up from a hit, or they don't DI correctly, and that leads to a lot of loss, because by the time you get to that level, the error is kind of the only differentiating thing. But I was thinking about if you were making a turn-based game, or a game that's less sort of real-time intense as a fighting game, are there things you can do to replace or replicate error in an interesting way that leads to these dynamic creative situations? Because I feel like a lot of people think turn-based games are very deterministic, so I want to ask you that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the... I mean, the ways in which turn-based games just lose out is that they don't have what I guess I term the rhythm action gameplay.
Yeah.
There's such an important pleasure loop of having generally a timing / accuracy based thing that you do well or you do badly, and that's such a massively important part of games that turn-based games just generally don't have, and I think this error stuff is very much tied into that. Having said that, when I think about bridge, people make errors all of the time, errors that they know they've made as soon as they've put the card down. So as long as the decision you're making is hard enough, and there's some limit on how much time you have to make it, which there generally is in any kind of competitive game. It's often like a sort of a social limit rather than a hardcore limit, but it's definitely there. You definitely have error, and it definitely introduces interesting things, but it doesn't tend to as dramatically morph the playboard as it does in real-time games. If you're looking at soccer, a bad kick or something will just dramatically change everything that's going on, and that's what can be so exciting, because it's really funny to see people making mistakes, and then it's really interesting to see what emerges from them. So it is an area that I've thought a lot about. I mean, maybe not specifically about player error, but about the rhythm action thing. And I think sometimes with the form, you've got to kind of embrace the weaknesses and say, well, we're just not going to be able to have that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess I don't really have a good answer to that.
That's really interesting. So a lot of it is about the complexity, the possible complexity of the decision introducing error. So if you take it sort of beyond where it's necessarily possible to make the optimal play every time, then that then becomes interesting. And also the impact that the decision has on the game state. Like maybe it would be interesting. I guess a lot of games where you make one turn and it completely flips the game state, they're often seen as very badly designed turn-based games. Like, that's never seemed to be that seems to be not what turn-based game players want, really.
Yeah, and I was going to say something similar to that, which is that errors in turn-based games tend to be a bit boring.
Yeah.
They tend to just be kind of disappointing. It's almost like missing a penalty kick, which it's just kind of not that exciting that you screwed that up, because nothing that interesting comes from it. If you talk about the big errors in a Magic the Gathering game, they tend to just mean you're about to lose from a position where you might otherwise have been about to win, which can be dramatic, but isn't that interesting, because it's not like a continuous game like kicking a ball, where you can see that the ball almost went in, and now it's bounced off and done something really, really interesting other to that. So, yeah, I'm racking my brains to think of a turn-based game where mistakes can be very exciting, and actually chess is probably one of those.
Yeah.
Mistakes in poker are incredibly boring, because the only mistakes you make in poker are about misjudging the probabilities of anything happening, which is really not a particularly interesting error to see, or even to work out if it's actually happened. I think, when I think about real-time, real-life sports, I think the errors are kind of sort of a significant portion of what they have over pro gaming, because you see the human, and it's always like a sort of a properly continuous play field where the errors feed back into the game, which is often not true. You make an error in CS and you're generally dead, or you've missed a very important shot. Whereas if I think about Smash, I can understand how that could work quite well, and better in Smash probably than Street Fighter, because Smash is, again, more of a continuous game with more of a space to play in.
Yeah.
But like mastering that kind of thing with turn-based stuff is, I mean, Mario and Luigi games that you actually happened to mention earlier, they brought in literal rhythm action in terms of how effective your RPG style attacks were. And that's really good, but again, that's never as satisfying as a game like Rocket League that's so singularly based around one system, and everything that happens within that system and is directly relevant, and that's just great. And sometimes you just have to accept that the game you're making can't have like every cool thing that games have.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's all massively cogent. I think one thing that I have thought about is a turn-based game where you actually sequence button presses in the same way that you do in a fighting game. So instead of just doing the action, you're actually kind of stringing together a sequence of button presses, and that could leave room for error, but it's kind of more of an intellectual, like you wouldn't know to time the button press X milliseconds after the other button press. I wonder if there's any scope to that idea, or if it's just mental.
Oh, I really like the idea of that's really inspiring. I like the idea of a simultaneous turn-based game where one of the considerations with your plan is like how hard it is to rhythm action do.
Right, yeah.
Like maybe if like you have like those action points in XCOM, and what if you could do something you could do a lot more, like try and hit like 3 different targets at once, but that would just like put a lot more onus on your rhythm action skills. That's a cool idea.
Marvellous. Okay, now we move on to games that were released this week in 2005 thanks to Eurogamer, and on the 28th of October 2005 we had Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth on the Xbox. Now, I believe this is the Call of Cthulhu game that people like, the kind of weird, adventure-y one, I think?
Yeah, why does Call of Cthulhu ring like lots of bells in my brain?
Is it the one with the weird sequence on the train where you have to run through the train and there's like... am I thinking of something else? I think...
Oh, actually, I think Call of Cthulhu is the main story by Lovecraft about Cthulhu.
Right.
Which might be why I'm remembering that so vividly.
There might be loads of different Call of Cthulhu games, of which this is one. But there's certainly a PC one that lots of people like. Someone on Twitter will point this out immediately. Anyway, Call of Cthulhu, Operation Flashpoint Elite on the Xbox. City of...
Not the crossover we'd be hoping for with that name.
Quite. City of Villains on the PC, which I think was the City of Heroes follow-up thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, I remember that. City of Heroes. Wow, that was kind of popular. That was like an MMO that really worked for a few years.
That's right, they let that one go. Pro Evo 5 on the PC. Starship Troopers on the PC.
Yeah, this was a somewhat interesting game.
Yeah.
Because it was kind of like... it was a bit like, what's that... Warhammer 40k game by Relic.
I know the one you mean. I don't know what it's called.
Call of Heroes or something like that. Something like that. Anyway, it was like that. It was like a cross between an RTS and kind of a smaller scale action RPG. I actually bought this. I think it was budgetly priced. I think it was 20 quid rather than 35 quid. And it wasn't very good, but it had like quite a lot of cool ingredients.
Yeah, I think I remember playing that with you actually. Viet Cong 2 on the PC. Now, one of the Viet Congs, I think it's famous for having either the worst voice acting ever, or yes, it's voice acting. One of these games has unbelievably bad voice acting, and they've kind of been since slammed for being a bit tasteless. Unsurprisingly, the Viet Cong games. X3 Reunion on the PC. This was quite... people liked this at the time. I think I owned this.
Yeah, I'm just still on Viet Cong. I had this idea that Viet Cong 1 was a build engine game.
Oh, yes.
But
Something
I might be
like
wrong
that.
about that.
That rings a bell.
it certainly rings a bell. These are interesting games. Yeah, I own X3 Reunion.
Yeah.
I have such a relationship with those kinds of games where I really want to play them, but sort of never quite managed to get into them.
Yeah, no, same here. I tried X4 as well back when it was bad, and now everyone just thinks it's bad generally. Makai Kingdom Chronicles of the Sacred Tome on the PS2, which is a tactical JRPG. What a massive surprise that is. People seem to quite like this. There must be so many of these. I would love to just see an exhaustive article about all of these different obscure JRPG tactical games. There must be so many of them. Metal Slug 4 on the PS2.
I'm a huge fan of Metal Slug 1. What a surprise. I first encountered it on a arcade machine in France when I'd basically broken my wrist in a cycling accident at the age of 10 or something, and it was just one of the most exciting things I've ever seen. I have to say, I've tried most of the sequels, and they've never really caught me as much as Metal Slug 1, which is a truly amazing game.
Yes. Dancing Stage Mario Mix on the GameCube. Probably. Did you play that with a broken wrist? Or probably more suitable?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I do not want to play the Mario version of one of those dancing games. Sorry.
Pack and Roll on the DS, which sounds like a government PSA about what you should do in a nuclear holocaust, but is probably a Pac-Man game of some form. Spyro Shadow Legacy on the DS. Spyro.
Now, I do have something to say about this.
Yes.
This is actually a pretty cool game,
Yeah?
and a pretty cool looking game. Like, it's an isometric, like, Spyro RPG.
Oh, right, okay. I didn't know that.
And I never actually bought it, but I was like really close to buying it a bunch of times because it looks so cool. Like weird isometric RPG, starring like a weird side character. I actually kind of think that might be like a secretly quite good game.
Okay, intriguing. Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects. Come on, seriously? But that's a real Marvel property? Rise of the Imperfects, honestly. SSX On Tour on the PSP. Cow Challengers on the PSP. Not
spelt KAO, not
I don't know what that is.
Cow Challenge.
In the spirit of great preparation, I'm going to Google that right now and see what comes up.
Okay.
Cow Challengers.
Well,
it seems to be something to do with Crash Bandicoot. It's not. It's not interesting. Well, that was good. Duel Master Shadow of the Code on the GBA. What a great name that is. Again,
that's a good name.
Let me just paste.
Marvel.
Let me
you
just
should call your stuff like that.
Paste this in here. Wow, this looks. What? Okay, you need to Google this right now.
Okay, I'm googling this right now.
It looks absolutely amazing. Duel Master Shadow of the Code.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
This looks like something that you would have bought if you'd known about it.
I encourage all of you to Google Duel Master Shadow of the Code. It looks brilliant.
Oh, it looks like some kind of the property looks like a very blatant Yu-Gi-Oh ripoff. Because there's characters with big hair brandishing cards, which, as we all know, Yu-Gi-Oh has the market cornered. And it's got these funny, like, wow, yeah, that looks amazing.
I'm going to play this later.
Dead to Rights 2 on the Xbox and PS2. Now, Dead to Rights, of course, made famous by the Retsu Prey Let's Players and leading to their catchphrase, Dead to Rights, which apparently is said rather too much in both games. So that a legendarily terrible game. Without Warning on the Xbox and PS2. Again, that seems like it's worth a paste. So let's go.
This was a great week for ridiculous game names. Wow, and actually, wow. Are you seeing the same thing I'm seeing?
Yes.
The film this is based on is very exciting.
I don't think it's based on that film, sadly.
You guys tuned in to hear us reacting to Google image searches for games that were released in 2005.
It's totally worth it. People love this bit. They love it, and I know that because nobody's ever mentioned it. The Suffering Ties That Bind on the Xbox, PS2, and PC. That sounds like a horror, third-person horror game I'm going for with that.
It sure does.
Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. That was the bad one, I think. The bad Tony Hawk game, of which there are several. Star Wars Battlefront 2 on the Xbox, PS2, PC, and PSP. Now, was the game that got John Walker into trouble, I think.
Oh, is that right?
I think it was. I think it was the one that he gave a good review to that was bad.
I own this game on the PSP.
Yes, maybe it was a different Star Wars Battlefront.
And it's kind of a pretty bonus.
Good.
Oh no, you're thinking about
Force Commander.
the RTS.
Yes, I am. I got that confused.
This is the weird, like, generally multiplayer
right.
game. No, you're thinking. Yeah, I remember
That's-
the 92%
Yes,
review John Walker
yes.
gave to that Star Wars game. We should have a whole segment on that.
I'm sure
next
he's
week.
delighted that people are still bringing that up. That's the end of that. Now we catapult ourselves unwillingly into the present day for the top 10 UK Steam games. And at number 10, it's Ark Survival Evolved. It just keeps on living. Number 9 is The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth, which is 40% off at the moment. Number 8 is Football Manager 2016. Number 7 is Tom Clancy's The Division. I lack any interest in these Tom Clancy games now whatsoever. Number 6 is Kerbal Space Program, which is 40% off. That just won't go away. Number 5 is Alien Isolation Collection at 50% off. Number 4 is Counter-Strike Go. Number 3 is Warhammer End Times Vermintide, which a few people have been on to me last week after I condemned this game solely on the basis of its name, and told me...
I've heard good things about this.
Told me it's very interesting, so I'm sorry, Warhammer End Times Vermintide. It was clearly...
I'm not even slightly sorry. I bet if I actually ended up playing this, I'd still hate it.
Clearly remiss of me to mock that by its name. Number 2 is Fallout 4, a game which isn't out yet. And number 1 is, boringly, Grand Theft Auto 5 at 33% off. That's the end of that. And now it's time to sashay sassily into your listener questions. And we begin with, in fact, Ashton Reyes, who asked the question, why? And the answer is because. We have Nelson from Video Games in the Bible, and he says, what, why, and how does one grunge their grime game? Now, this is a series of elaborate in-jokes predicated on the fact that he confused the music genres grunge and grime. And the answers to that are you don't, and you don't. Philip Back asks, would you spend 3 years... Okay, this is good, right? We've got to focus on this. We've got to give this the due attention it deserves, because this is very important, and I have a lot of detail around this question. Would you spend 3 years on a Minions game if it meant you had the budget and freedom to do whatever you wanted afterwards? Now, he clarified this as it literally makes your career. You earn so much money from this, you can really do whatever you want. You're made for your career. You can fund multiple personal projects. You get back end on the Minions game, but in addition to the 3 years of development, which, by the way, is the worst kind of development possible, they're really harsh about what you can put into the Minions game. They change gameplay all the time. It's terrible. You have to spend 6 months flying around the world talking about how great and culturally important Minions are at promotional events. So this is the ultimate selling your soul to the devil question. What do you think about this?
Well, I was definitely going to say no until I found out that I got to spend 6 months flying around the world doing Minions PR,
I know.
which sounds great.
It does.
In general, 3 years is too long.
Yeah.
And like, if we'd never had our success, you know, and then I would definitely sort of say yes to this, you know, because it's like I'm definitely able to do 3 years of purgatory to get to a good result.
Yeah.
But where I am right now, I would not do this unless it was like sort of, you know, like $50 million, in which case I might do this.
I think it's kind of amazing to be able to say that, but I think I agree with you. Like, we would definitely have done this in 2007, I think.
Yeah,
absolutely.
definitely.
And now we wouldn't. I mean, we're not at the stage where we can do whatever we want, which it would be amazing. But it's just funny that we're lucky enough through the game that we've made that we don't have to do this Minions game. But I'm sure there are a lot
I don't have long enough left making games
yeah.
to give up 3 years.
Yeah, 3 years is a very
I'm not saying I'm going to stop in 5 years or anything, but 3 years is a really significant portion of the game making time I have left. So no, I wouldn't do this.
Which is kind of amazing. So a serious answer to a very stupid yet brilliant question. Thank you, Philip Back. David G. Barrett asks, what do we think of the new Mario Maker update? So this basically just added checkpoints and a few other things, and I find that disappointing because the thing that was going to interest me was this ability to make sequences of levels. Like, I'd kind of quite like to make some weird story in Mario Maker, and you still can't do that. People are getting excited because you can place the checkpoints at a 45-degree angle, and they believe this implies the future edition of Slopes. So, so there you go.
You can't have slopes yet in Mario Maker?
I believe you cannot.
Slopes my favourite aspect of Super Mario World. No, they weren't. That sounds good. I'm glad they're still doing it. Like, Mario Maker is the closest thing to getting me to buy another Wii U after I gave my one to you because I dislike it so much. So I guess I'm sort of mildly optimistic about it.
A hamster asks, what's your favourite smiley? Mine is the semicolon, full stop, semicolon. And I'm going to say that I think yours is the O, full stop, O one, because you do that a lot.
The O underscore, little O one.
Yeah.
I think my favourite one is probably just colon Z, but I do like capital O underscore O.
And he also asks, what is interacting with the press like for you? And what's the funniest question you've gotten? I think interacting with the press, I think this got a lot better, actually, over the time we've been doing this in terms of like the quality of questions that you get. I think the press that generally cover our stuff are really engaged with what we're doing and ask very apposite questions, which is sort of great, really. So that's good. The funniest question, I think Alec Meir asked you something about Luigi after you mentioned him in the Frozen Cortex preview.
I talked about how much I liked the strong emotional feelings I had towards my opponents in Mario Kart.
Yes.
And yes, you're right. He did ask me something about Luigi, which I've scrubbed from my brain.
With an important question about Luigi. HD asks, the answer I need to know is, will you guys provide sponsorship for the Determinants Championships of 2015? And the answer to that is no.
Not beforehand. If they happen
yes.
and they're exciting, I might buy HD a drink afterwards, if that counts.
Andrew Roper asks, him of the infamous rap battle question, which we're not answering again this week. You are preparing for a bank robbery, but you have to be an animal. Which animal would you be and why? Now, there was some argument as to whether or not we were allowed to choose eagles. And just solely on the basis of that, I'm going to choose an eagle. Just to be political, do you have an animal choice? I have to say why. That was why.
I really don't have anything pithy for this. I guess I'd be a kangaroo. I have no idea.
Good. Greg Bond asks, any games you're looking forward to playing? Pretty much just Fallout 4 at the moment. I guess Legacy of the Void. That's about it.
Yeah, it's just Fallout 4 for me as well, I'm afraid.
Who would... This doesn't have a verb. Who would in a fight between the Wombles and the Smurfs? I think that's my title.
The Smurfs.
Not the original question. I'm going to go with the Wombles. I think they would. Magpie McGraw asks, how many days of May the current date be with you? Have you missed since you started? And I think I've missed about 6 or 7. So people who say that I've done it every day are not paying attention. They don't understand the true nature of the form.
Were you on a boat when you missed those days?
I was on a boat for some of those days. That's absolutely correct. That's going to be it for this edition of Visiting the Village. We're very glad that you joined us, and we hope that you join us next time.
Yes, goodbye.
Goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.